I was looping a silver ribbon around the final present when the phone started ringing. It was one of those frigid December days in Seattle when the sky remains iron gray and daylight disappears before I notice I never switched a lamp on. The label attached to the gift read, Walter. Inside, I had placed a vintage fishing lure that I'd managed to find online, one of those rare models my father had casually mentioned once. The screen displayed, Helen. I grinned, dried my hands with a dish towel, and picked up, greeting, Hi, Helen. Her voice remained steady, neither tense nor affectionate, simply steady. Walter, Adam, and I have been talking. We've decided it might be for the best if you didn't join us for Christmas this year. There was a gap, but not complete quiet. In the background, I caught the sound of a chair sliding, a mug clinking, and then a different voice. The sound became clearer to me at that point, recognizably male and unmistakably familiar. It was my brother, Adam Thatcher, who let out a brief laugh. Adam said, No hard feelings, Claire. Let's just act like we don't know each other this year. It'll be easier for everyone. Sure, I replied, though my voice never found its way out. I didn't give them a response, not because there was nothing I wanted to say, but because I was afraid my voice might betray me by shaking if I tried. My mother, Helen Thatcher, cleared her throat and quietly offered, We just need a little distance, sweetheart. This isn't a permanent thing. She spoke as if she were simply calling off a dinner reservation, acting like my being around was merely a choice from the menu that no longer appealed to them this year. When the conversation ended, I remained in my kitchen, the phone clutched in one hand and that silver ribbon still in the other. The present lying on the counter suddenly looked absurd to me. I held back my tears. Rather, I carefully returned the present to the closet. Setting it beside the snowflake wrapping paper, I realized I wouldn't have any use for any more. Maybe it was only meant for this year. Perhaps their intentions were gentle. Yet a single question lingered in the room like pine and regret. Had they made up their minds about me long before they asked me to stay away? That phone call was not the true beginning. I realize that now. At the time, however, I believed we were still a family. Imperfect, certainly, a bit lopsided, but all connected by a shared center. I was raised in Bar Harbor, Maine, in a 2-story colonial with green shutters and a swinging porch seat that groaned in the shifting breeze. My mother, Helen Thatcher, taught 3rd grade at our neighborhood elementary school. My father, Walter Thatcher, worked as an accountant, steady, not showy. My brother, Adam Thatcher, who is 3 years younger than I am, was the sort of kid people called a handful, but forgave easily when he grinned. He was blessed with that slippery kind of charm that could persuade teachers to give him extra time on assignments, and the neighbors usually pretended not to notice. I was the reserved one, always with a book, neatly arranging my shoes under the bed, reciting state capitals for entertainment. I can't pinpoint exactly when things began to feel unfair. Compliments for Adam Thatcher were served with dessert, while mine usually earned just a nod and the slightest smile. If Adam got a C+ in algebra, my mother, Helen Thatcher, baked brownies. When I won the district science fair, my mother only remarked, That's nice, sweetheart. Did you remember to call Grandma? Walter Thatcher would sometimes squeeze my shoulder, maybe as a quiet language between us, but he never actually spoke the words. At 18, I left Bar Harbor for Cascadia University with a scholarship and a quiet hope that distance might shift the balance. It didn't. Adam, meanwhile, remained at home. He didn't finish community college, spent a year in real estate, moved on to landscaping, then drifted into nothing. By 33, he was still living in my parents' basement, and yet he kept making the effort. When he finally left, it was thanks to a fresh lease that both my mother and my father co-signed. Later, I found out that my brother, Adam Thatcher, was getting some monthly rent assistance that helped cover his half. I never resented Adam Thatcher getting help. What stung was the way my own efforts had quietly vanished from memory. I drove Walter Thatcher to 2 outpatient surgeries. I spent weekends reorganizing my mother's craft supplies whenever her arthritis got worse. I sent over grocery gift cards during the pandemic, even as my own hours were reduced at work. But not a single mention of that ever made it onto the holiday card. Adam was always considered the son figuring out his life. Meanwhile, I was simply busy somewhere in Seattle. There were moments, maybe a few, when my brother, Adam Thatcher, turned to me for support. After a tough breakup, he once phoned me in tears. When my father, Walter Thatcher, fell down, it was me Adam relied on for the insurance paperwork. Once, he even called me the Rock. I remember that, since it was something I hadn't heard directly from anyone else before. Then he said the words, "We'll act like you aren't part of things this year." He delivered it with a casual tone, as if making a joke that wasn't meant to draw a real laugh. It felt as though he had already decided that forgetting me would be effortless. Had something about him shifted? Or had this dynamic always been present, and I had just refused to acknowledge it? 7 days after that conversation, I logged on to Facebook, not because I missed them, or so I told myself. I convinced myself it was merely a quick scroll, just a bit of curiosity. And there it was, the annual family Christmas picture. It was taken in the usual place near the fireplace, with the same red and gold decorations on the mantel, and even those familiar crocheted stockings my mother, Helen Thatcher, always put up each year. But my own presence was missing from the image. In the spot where I used to stand, third from the left, next to Walter Thatcher, someone different had taken my place. Diana Travers, the neighbor who lived 2 doors down, was in the photograph, and my memory of her was only passing. She had always been noticeably kind, dressed up for brunch, and she had never wanted children. Her spouse operated 2 car dealerships scattered throughout Maine. She appeared in the image, beaming between Adam and my father, Walter, clutching a glass of eggnog as if she'd been a part of our family for many years. The description underneath read, "So thankful for chosen family this year." Additional images appeared after that. Diana helping Helen Thatcher with the cranberry sauce, Diana lifting a wrapped present, and Diana toasting with Adam Thatcher. The problem wasn't just that I was left out. The issue was that someone else had filled my place. Just 7 days ago, I believed I was the complicated daughter, the one my family struggled to connect with. At this point, I understood that I had been quietly and smoothly substituted, almost courteously, like a broken bulb finally being replaced. I opened up our previous family group chat. It was simply gone. Not archived, not renamed, just disappeared. I tried searching for past tags, old birthday pictures, Thanksgiving snaps, even the out-of-focus one from my father, Walter Thatcher's, retirement celebration. Many of those faces still appeared, though not as many as I remembered. And in the photos that remained, I was never tagged. I hadn't been untagged either, just overlooked, as if I had been there but not truly part of things. There was an almost sterile quality to it. Nothing dramatic, no arguments, just a silent, gentle erasure, almost as if being cautious. On impulse, I called Aunt Patricia Henley, my mother Helen Thatcher's younger sister. It had been months since we last spoke, but she was always fond of the cookies I baked for the holidays. She answered, sounding surprised and a bit unsure. "Oh, honey, I thought you were going to spend Christmas with friends in Seattle." That's what my mother, Helen Thatcher, told me. I didn't bother to set her straight. It didn't seem worth it. Once we hung up, I sat alone in my place, looking at the empty patch on the wall where my own Christmas picture once was. I had removed it a few days before, without much thought or any real intention. I believed I was moving aside to create space. It turned out that area had already been taken over. What hurt the most wasn't that they had done this, but how effortlessly it had happened. I hadn't made any statements. No one received a message from me about needing distance or setting any boundaries. I simply faded from view. I stopped showing up, and I didn't offer any explanations. When people invited me to join their holiday parties, I just smiled and replied, maybe next year. When Emily Cross, my dearest friend in Seattle, suggested she'd come with me to Maine just so I could speak to them face to face, I told her, there's nothing left to say. Honestly, I didn't know if there had ever really been anything to express. I took down the partially decorated tree that stood in my apartment. The gold mesh ribbon, adorned with tiny silver snowflakes that I had chosen, went unused back into its box. I carefully placed the ornaments back into their boxes, holding the paper sleeves as if I were handling something delicate. In truth, perhaps I was. The present set aside for my father, Walter Thatcher, remained untouched on the shelf in my closet. The gift for my mother, Helen Thatcher, a hardback book detailing quilting designs throughout American history, remained there as well. She used to find joy in items like that. On Christmas Eve, I wrote out a draft of a card, keeping it simple. Hope this year is a gentle one. I never got around to sealing the card. It lingered on the counter in my kitchen for days, the envelope unstamped and an edge gently curling from the arid air. Come Christmas morning, I made French toast. I poured coffee into my mug, added a little cream, and took a seat at the kitchen island so I could look out the window. There wasn't a fireplace, no stockings, no melodies, just the low whir of the fridge and the wind sweeping softly against the panes. I didn't shed any tears. I decided that, in its own way, that counted as a small triumph. That afternoon, I went for a walk beside the banks of the Seattle River. Pairs strolled past, their hands gloved and entwined. Children weaved between slushy patches on their scooters, hollering about building snowmen. No matter where I wandered, it seemed like the world was staging Christmas all around me. Yet I simply passed through it, detached. Once I returned home, the greeting card, still sealed, remained exactly where I had left it on the table. I gripped it for a moment, rotated it in my hands, then put it away in the drawer with expired coupons and some stray batteries. I refrained from sharing anything on social media. I ignored the few Merry Christmas messages from former colleagues. Even Emily Cross's "thinking of you" earned nothing more than a heart emoji in response. What I felt wasn't exactly resentment. Honestly, it was the gradual understanding that I had been written out of their narrative. Perhaps I never truly belonged in it, at least not in the way I once believed. Sometimes, it isn't a door slamming that signals the end. It's the one that's quietly locked while I am still inside. The letter arrived in the middle of January. It wasn't from anyone in my family, nor was it from Maine. The return address belonged to a law firm based in Providence, Rhode Island. I nearly tossed it aside unopened, thinking it was ordinary mail, but something about the heavy envelope made me pause. The paper inside was thick, clearly meant for official business. I found a neatly typed letter enclosed. I, Claire Thatcher, serve as the executor for the estate of Margaret Thatcher Smith. My attendance is required for the inheritance proceedings. I need to contact them to acknowledge receipt of this notice. My grandmother, Margaret Thatcher Smith, my father Walter's mother, had always been the family member who truly saw me, never making me prove my worth to her. I stared at the letter in disbelief, certain she had passed away 6 years ago. I dialed the phone number I had been given. The person who answered sounded composed, mature, and precise. He introduced himself as Frederick Payne, the estate attorney. Your grandmother died on October 27th, he informed me. Of this year, he continued. I needed more information, so I lowered myself into the chair with care. That can't be, I protested. I would have noticed something. My father would have given me that information. A moment of silence followed. It wasn't out of shock, but rather from steady persistence. Ms. Thatcher, I think it's best if you step inside. There is additional information to share. 2 days after that, I found myself inside a subdued, oak-paneled meeting room. On the table rested a leather-bound folder, a still full cup of tea, and a gentle-looking man presenting me with a copy of a death record. The listed date of death was October 27th. There was also an obituary from the Portland Herald. It stated that she was survived by her son, Walter Thatcher. Her daughter-in-law, Helen, and grandson, Adam, were also listed. But there was no inclusion of my name. It was total silence, an absence. As though I had been erased. As though I had never been the child who cleared her yard, made her tea when her hip was sore, or had driven 2.5 hours solely to fix a light because she didn't trust repairmen. In a soft voice, I asked, "Why did no one inform me?" She had specifically asked that I be the one to reach out to you herself. She guessed my family would probably postpone things. He slid another paper across the table toward me. It was her will. All of her property, investments, and possessions were bequeathed to me, except for a small amount set aside for Adam and a few mementos intended for my father, Walter. This was revised 2.5 years ago, Frederick Payne explained, along with video recordings to verify it was genuine. He pulled out a laptop and started a video. On the screen appeared my grandmother, Margaret Thatcher Smith. She looked somewhat slimmer and weaker than I remembered, but her gaze was keen. "Claire, sweetheart, if you're watching this, it means I'm no longer here. And I have a feeling my parents, Helen and Walter, have left me in the dark. I want you to understand that I made this choice with full awareness and deep affection. You were always willing to visit me. You never asked anything of me. My parents, Helen and Walter, only visited when they wanted assistance, most often for Adam." I stopped, pressing my lips together. After my grandfather died, I put Helen in charge of my affairs while I healed from surgery. She took advantage of that authority to use my home as collateral for loans. They started with smaller amounts and gradually increased them. When I discovered what was happening, I revoked their access, updated my will, and informed them. Their response was anger. More videos arrived, one after another. In each recording, she mentioned specific dates, displayed bank records, spoke with precision, and even cracked jokes. There was no confusion in her demeanor. Nobody was forcing her. She looked weary, yet she was completely in charge. After the video ended, I remained there quietly. She intended for this to be safeguarded, Frederick Payne told me softly. And so I'd understand she saw me. That was the instant everything shifted, if you wish to call it that. The issue had never been about inheritance or property, but about losing someone dear to me while her relatives deliberately kept knowledge of the funeral from me. Their intention was for me to never find out what occurred. They erased me, first from gatherings, then from family photographs, later from the published memorial. But now they were about to discover what it was like when someone they had excluded began to write herself back into the narrative. They requested that we meet face to face. They claimed that speaking in person would be easier in a neutral location, as though a hotel brunch in Bar Harbor could somehow undo everything that had already been shattered. I agreed. Not because I expected answers or even a real apology, but because some part of me still needed that moment of eye contact to search for any remnants beneath the quiet. I arrived early. The dining room felt still, softly lit, with a few mugs of coffee sitting half-drunk on tables. I picked out a spot in the corner, positioned so I could watch the entrance. I wanted to be able to see them as soon as they walked in. They arrived promptly. My mother, Helen Thatcher, looked older, not just thinner, but as if something essential inside her had been carved away. My father, Walter Thatcher, wore his long-time wool coat, but now he seemed diminished within it. Adam, my brother, appeared healthier than I'd seen him in a long time, freshly shaved, self-satisfied, and sporting a watch that flashed gold as he sat down. We exchanged casual conversation at first, nothing of any importance. Then Helen got straight to the point. She mentioned that there had been quite a bit of confusion following Margaret Thatcher Smith's death. She insinuated that Margaret Thatcher Smith may not have been of sound mind when making her choices, and that the recordings didn't present the complete truth. I let her have the floor. She moved with deliberate caution, like someone trying to fix a damaged frame without acknowledging it was broken. At some point, she suggested making changes to the inheritance. She said the investments ought to be split evenly between Adam and me. She continued that, as for the home, Margaret's home should naturally remain within the family. Legacy is important, she remarked. Adam stayed quiet until that moment, but when he spoke up, his response was biting. He sneered at the suggestion that I was entitled to anything at all. He insisted that our grandmother always favored him. He argued that I didn't grasp the true meaning of family. When I looked at him, I only saw the child to whom I once read bedtime stories, now an adult convinced he deserved something he never truly worked for. My father, Walter Thatcher, tried to intervene, speaking gently. He suggested, "Perhaps there's a way we can honor everyone's wishes." But I already knew what he meant by that. The goal wasn't reconciliation. It was to change the outcome and make sure their names appeared in the credits. I rose to my feet, moving deliberately. I allowed the significance of the situation to sink in for everyone. I told them my grandmother, Margaret Thatcher Smith, had not been confused. She was deliberate. She noticed their actions and protected me in the only way she could. I kept my tone level, never blaming, just stating the simple truths, the ones they hoped no one would ever mention. Helen Thatcher tensed up. Helen Thatcher told me to have a seat. She said that people were watching us. I responded that they could look all they wanted. Then I voiced what had been stuck in my throat since Christmas. I told Helen it was never about me causing issues, but about me refusing to keep filling the part they assigned me. Walter dropped his gaze to his hands. Adam spoke quietly, barely audible. I missed what he said. It didn't matter. When I began to go, Helen Thatcher called my name. She told me that if I left this time, I shouldn't expect an invitation back again. I didn't look over my shoulder, since they had already made it clear I was unwanted. After that meal, they reached out once more. Texts, calls I ignored, and a lengthy email from my father, Walter Thatcher, beginning with, "We still love you," and concluding, "But your reaction was deeply hurtful." I never sent a response. I wasn't upset. Not any longer. That was the strange thing about the whole experience. After I left that stage behind, people insisted on assigning me roles. Sometimes the lovely daughter, sometimes the resentful sibling, or the unwanted outcast. I became aware of the surprising stillness in my thoughts. A deep calm had settled in. There was no more anxious spiral of thoughts, no relentless doubting. Where before the quiet had seemed like banishment, it now felt like clean oxygen. I started seeing my therapist again. I opened up to Dr. Layla Khan completely, talked about the footage, the memorial, and how I'd skipped out on that brunch they called a reunion. She took it all in, then softly asked, "Do you actually want them to be part of your life?" I reflected on it and replied, "Not under these circumstances. Not if I have to perform, not if there are strings attached, not if every interaction is quietly scored and kept." I explained how I had always believed I just needed to demonstrate I was worthy. But lately, I think the real lesson was to let the effort go. She gave me a knowing look, scribbled something in her notebook, and then she spoke the word I hadn't been able to face until that point. "You didn't abandon them, Claire. All I did was refuse to let them act as though I was still present." That evening, I removed the group message from my phone and deleted my parents' birthdays from my reminders. I carefully packed away the old framed photograph, the last one of us grinning together on the porch, and tucked it deep into my closet. This wasn't done out of resentment, but simply because I no longer wished for it to occupy a place on display. They kept telling everyone that I was the one who had changed. Maybe there was some truth to that, but things were actually simpler than they made it out to be. I had just decided to stop feeling sorry for taking up space. 15 months later, I organized Christmas at my place for the very first time. It was a small gathering, just a handful of friends. These were the people who had witnessed the entire breakdown and stayed in my corner regardless. Emily arrived with her signature cinnamon cookies. Julian showed up with more wine than necessary. Someone brought string lights that twinkled overhead. Someone else provided the laughter. Instead of a tree, candles glowed in the windows and a pot of spiced cider simmered on the stove. Gentle music played somewhere in the distance. Raymond White's voice was soft and familiar as always. The windows grew misty from the warmth, and someone traced a smiley face in the condensation. Nobody asked about my family. Nobody invited lingering memories to join us. Shortly before we ate, I stepped into the living room and set a small framed picture on the mantel. The photo showed just me and my grandmother, Margaret Thatcher Smith, sitting together on her porch. I must have been 12. She held a mug of tea in her hands. We were both laughing at something out of view. There was nobody else in the photo. I hadn't asked anyone to take it. It was just us. I paused there, gazing at the snapshot, and softly said, "Thank you for seeing me." Later that evening, my phone buzzed. There was a message request from Adam Thatcher. I didn't read it. Another had come from my mother, Helen Thatcher, containing only a single period. No explanation, no further detail. Almost as though she still believed that withholding words meant control. I exited the app and turned out the lamp. The photograph remained on the mantel, undisturbed and still. It never demanded a reason or required any apologies. Its presence was constant, just like mine, even during moments when no one believed I was truly there.